And welcome back, everyone. Let us talk about giant robots for a little bit. One of my favorite topics, I will admit. This is a brief history of giant robots. We're going to go through just kind of what's happened in terms of mecha over time. A few quick notes. I have not seen every mecha ever made, every mecha series ever made. I will talk about as much as I can, as much as I've seen. But unfortunately, I am limited in terms of my exposure to things. But again, we'll try to cover as much as we can. Also, this is not going to be a review of everything that's ever been popular. There's certainly anime that are popular, but that weren't particularly memorable. Like, they didn't really change things for the medium as a whole. They didn't have much of an impact on the medium, and that's what I'm going to try to sort of focus on here. There's a lot of mecha. Like, there's a huge amount. We're going to try to focus on that. This is going to be kind of a Gundam-centric panel, partly because Gundam has been so influential on anime in general. So we will be touching on Gundam a fair bit, but there will be other mecha. Don't worry about it. Just FYI. So first thing we have to address before we get anything further is an apparently simple question. What is mecha? Right? Is this car mecha? It's a mechanical thing. Good question, James. No big Gundam spoilers. I'll talk about just sort of, and for generally when I talk about anime, I'll talk about kind of the setup, the premise, but I'm not going to talk, in detail about any sort of plot spoilers. So is this car mecha? Well, technically, it is a mechanical object, and there may be a mecha designer on a car racing show, for example, who designs the cars. So mecha designer sometimes just means designer of, complicated mechanical objects in a show, if they need to be, explained in detail. But for our purposes, that's not mecha. We're not going to count that as mecha. Is this mecha? Powered armor. So essentially, robot things, but they're they are directly related to the human body, right? There's no man-machine interface, so to speak. I personally consider powered armor to be mecha, but for this panel, I'm going to exclude it just because of time and space and so forth. So for our purposes, mecha, we're going to consider essentially three things: piloted giant robots, remote-controlled giant robots, and intelligent giant robots. Giant robots with their own intelligence, their own free will, so to speak. Now, what's interesting to me is that the history of mecha actually begins with early 20th century Japanese science fiction. This is not actually an image from an early Japanese science fiction novel. I couldn't find any that were like representative, and there weren't 100 pixels by 50 pixels. This is just representation of sort of general late 19th, early 20th century sci-fi nonsense. If you go back and read early Japanese science fiction stories, particularly stories for young boys, they often had the following formula. A young teenage boy is living in Japan when Japan is under attack unfairly and unprovoked by a major Western power that is often left unnamed, but is something like, Britannia. And they're attacked, and again, through no fault of their own. And again, this is 20s, 30s, 40s. And then this young teenager discovers that his uncle slash father slash grandfather has secretly been directing the construction of a secret, super powerful submarine. And the boy discovers this, and of course discovers that his father has decided that this 14-year-old boy should command the super secret, incredibly powerful, super secret submarine. And so the 14-year-old boy goes out and fights the, oppressive Western power and wins, often at the sacrifice of, great numbers of Japanese. And often, the submarine gets destroyed. But they beat off the Western invaders. And anyone with a knowledge of early 20th century Japanese history, yeah, might seem some parallels here to what's going on, both historically in terms of obviously there was this concern about Western powers and the Meiji Restoration and how Japan was facing off against these very, very powerful other countries and other civilizations. And this was a very obvious power fantasy for preteen, tween, and young teen boys, is that Japan would get attacked and we just have to kind of fight them back and do what we can. And I'm going to get into this super powerful thing because as a average 14-year-old Japanese boy, there's only so much I can do, but yeah. So that kind of becomes that you can see some patterns there in Mecha later on. But let's move forward into actual anime. As we talked about yesterday, many consider Astro Boy to be the first anime, arguable depending on how you count it. But Astro Boy is certainly the first giant robot anime in the sense that giant robots are in it. Not in the sense that it is a giant robot anime in the genre definition. So giant robots show up in Astro Boy because Astro Boy is about robots in general, robots in society. So you have big construction robots and all sorts of different things and circus robots and such. So you do have giant robots showing up. And robots in general as a theme, but I wouldn't really call it a mecha series in the modern sense. That wouldn't come until later that year with Tetsujin 28 Go, actually it's not 28, but whatever, or Gigantor as it was localized in America. Now, the story within the world behind Gigantor is that Gigantor was built to beat the Allies in World War II. Like, in the story of the manga and the anime, this robot was built as a super powerful weapon to beat the Allies and was under construction. There were a bunch of different versions of it. And with the 28th version, they finally got one that worked, but it was, August of 1945, and the war ended and they had to mothball it. So, much later in the advanced year of 1980 or whenever it was that the show was set, Gigantor is brought back up to use again. I'm going to say life, not really life, to fight crime, because that's what you use a giant robot for, right? Is to fight gangsters. So more than just gangsters, but so Gigantor was in a lot of ways like a manga to anime about World War II and about actual things that Japan was struggling with around this. Because when you think about it, the guy who founded Honda learned how to be a mechanic by building engines for bombers in World War II. And he used that expertise to build engines for like motorcycles and such after World War II. So there's a lot of stuff, there was a lot of high technology that Japan capitalized on post-World War II that came out of a lot of the war technology during World War II. And that was kind of a question that people were grappling with, is that how ethical is it to reuse these skills that we kind of earned with blood money, if you will. So kind of remarkable for a kid's show, and again, this is less than a generation after the end of World War II. We're already seeing those themes in anime. Also notable for the fact that Gigantor is not piloted from within. The main character has a little remote control. And because as we all know, you can pilot a giant robot or control a giant robot with a single joystick and 2 buttons. And that's basically how you control Gigantor. So the main character would get called in to a various problem, and then would call in Gigantor to come swoop in and beat the bad guys. And this actually caused something of a problem, because the thing about this is when your solution to everything is a giant multi-story tall robot, there are only so many stories you can tell with that in the real world, right? Like, gangsters are escaping through that alley. What's the giant robot going to do? Bash the alley, right? And you try to capture them. So there were actually a relatively limited number of stories you could tell with Gigantor, but these sorts of stories of remote-controlled giant robots did become kind of the de facto giant robot pattern for the next decade or so. remote-controlled giant robots, which was a fairly obvious power fantasy for kids of the time, right? It'd be awesome to have a little remote control, press a button, giant robot sweeps in. That would change in 1972 with the introduction of Mazinger Z. Mazinger is the first piloted mecha. In fact, you can see right there in the center, that little thing there is actually a little hovercraft, basically, that the main character climbs into and then literally drops into Mazinger's head to dock into Mazinger to pilot it. So the main character is literally up in the head there. And so Mazinger brings with it a completely new metaphor. Because now the mecha is an extension of the main character. There is a much more direct responsibility between these two things. Literally, I push a lever, Mazinger punches. So now the mecha is more of a metaphor for the main character's actions and behaviors. And so you can bring in different drama. The main character can do immature things in the giant robot, which then have negative effects. And so this really marks a distinction where mecha series become less about wouldn't it be cool if, and more about, wow, I have this big responsibility that I have to enact directly. And so it became much more about adolescent issues, growing up, with Mazinger Z. 1974, a couple years later, brought Get a Robo, which was an adaptation of a manga by Go Nagai, who also created Mazinger Z. He was a very popular creator at the time. And Get a Robo was the first combining mecha. Now, I would recommend, if you're up for a laugh, going on YouTube, looking up the opening credit sequence to Get a Robo, because they will show you the transformation sequence for Get a Robo. I'm not going to show it here because YouTube and copyright, and I'll probably get taken down. But basically, it's 3 vehicles which all combine into Get a Robo, and literally, they all come together and touch, and then just morph like Play-Doh into Get a Robo. There's no attempt to make it mechanically possible. It's just 3 vehicles and then something. It is Get a Robo. So it's really funny from a modern perspective. But Get a Robo lets you do a couple of different things. One is this gives you more characters in your mecha series, more protagonists. So you can tell stories about the interactions between those characters. Obviously, you have multiple characters in Mazinger Z and so forth. In fact, there are multiple pilots in Mazinger Z. There is a girl mecha pilot in episode 1 of Mazinger Z. Can we get back to that, please? But Get a Robo, you now have multiple characters all piloting the mecha, and they can all have their drama. So that kind of expands the melodramatic possibilities of mecha series within the various premise. It also has another big advantage. It's no secret. Why are people making mecha series? Why are people putting together money to make 50-episode, 80-episode mecha series on television? Toys. They're selling merchandise to kids. That money goes back in and fills up the coffers that were spent to make the anime series. It's more complicated than that, but especially for mecha series, there was a very strong relationship between the merch has to sell for us to be able to make more stuff. Merch was a very direct correlation. What does Get a Robo do? Now you have 4 toys to buy. You have each of the vehicles, and you have the giant robot. They don't actually combine physically because toy technology at the time was nowhere near capable of actually creating a combiner Get a Robo toy. It would later, but in the initial release, it was you'd buy the 3 vehicles, then you'd buy the Get a Robo toy separately and pretend. So this was an important change, and this is the thing that you see. You see a lot of this is a trend. What we'll see is that creators are trying to evolve the formula and find ways of making it more effective and more efficient, both in the story side and also in the merch side, right? And people get really upset about the idea of merchandising being a part of the making of an anime series. But on the one hand, like, it's reality. On the other hand, there's usually a certain amount of separation where the toy company is usually not coming in and sitting in on every story meeting and telling them, no, this character has to say this in this episode. The toy company is setting up parameters, they're making sure that characters are reasonably well handled, that kind of stuff. 1 second. Could someone grab the cookies? And so that is a thing. You have evolutions of the story, but also of the merch that can actually be made. Just realized I want the cookies to burn. So, a year later, we got Brave Raideen, 1975. And this combined a couple of different things. It is the first Transformer mecha series. It's the first anime series by Yoshihiko Tomino, and it's the first anime series that was not based on a manga. First mecha series, not based on a manga. So, why does it matter because it's a Transformer? Because, in case you missed it, lots of Transformer things later. Lots of transforming giant robots later. So this evolution stuck. Yoshihiko Tomino would go on to create some fairly important mecha series, which we'll get to later, but also the idea that you were not based on an original manga that you have to adapt gave the writers much more freedom in their concept. Now they could really do something that A, made the merch work, or B, made the story work. And they could kind of just be a lot more free in their stories. So time moves on. Folks continue to evolve. These are all still, to be clear, Monster of the Week mecha series. Tween boy is given by his uncle/father/grandfather control of a super powerful giant robot to defeat not the Western powers, because it's post-World War II, but aliens, usually, or monsters or whatever. There's still that formula. 78, we get an interesting anime called Invincible Superman Zambot 3, another Yoshihiko Tomino series, notable for the fact that this is where Tomino earns his nickname, Kill 'Em All Tomino. Now, again, mecha series at this point are aimed squarely at the preteen market, maybe tweens, but young boys. Zambot 3 is about aliens from another planet who want to wipe out humanity, send monsters down, giant monsters down every week. And this is actually a combiner, so 3 preteen children are all chosen to pilot Zambot 3. And then about 2/3 of the way, oh boy, does this thing get dark. We start getting human bombs, people exploding on the street, literally, people getting kidnapped for experimentation, and large amounts of the human population getting no more over the course of this story. It gets real dark, especially for a show that is not that for the first half. And all of a sudden, mecha series are tackling much darker material, much more serious material than you were generally seeing in other anime at the time. Again, this is still the 70s. Anime is still squarely aimed at kids. You weren't seeing dark stuff. You'd had Space Battleship Yamato, definitely melodramatic and serious. You're getting things like Captain Harlock and Galaxy Express 39s. But now Mecha was picking up on that trend. And you're starting to get really serious, dark anime series out of that. Now, Tomino was working at a studio named Sunrise. And Sunrise had actually been founded by a couple of animators who had left Mushi Pro, Astro Boy Studio, to found a studio to focus specifically on mecha series. They basically wanted to specialize in these particularly merchandisable shows, the idea being that they could sit down with a toy company and make a really effective, dramatic, interesting series because they had experience working with this. And it's one of those things where if you just kind of grab a random animation studio, they may not understand that relationship well, but they understood it, so they can kind of go and nail and get it done. And so they were doing a lot of this evolution of different ideas. So the following year, they decided, hey, let's try something different. Instead of doing Monster of the Week, what if we told a war story? What if we told a story kind of like World War II, where it's two sides. One side does terrible things, but the other side has some people in it that are not great either. And it is just a story of two sides fighting in a war. And so we definitely have protagonists. We definitely have antagonists. But it will feel a lot more grounded. No monsters, no aliens, people fighting people. And that was Mobile Suit Gundam. Now, I think everyone here has probably heard of Gundam. But remarkably at the time, Gundam was not hugely popular. It had its audience. But the audience was relatively small, and it was not a big success when it first came out. So much so that they actually ended it early. They were not given their full run and had to stop at episode 43. Episode 42 over here. So that was a problem for everyone involved because they were really changing this up. And one of the reasons they did this is because, again, think the toys. You have, all right, let's say you're 8 years old and you're a big fan of Brave Radine, right? And every week Brave Radine goes out and fights some monster kaiju. What Brave Radine toys are you going to buy? You're going to buy Brave Radine. You'll buy maybe one or two of the Monsters of the Week, the really cool ones. But how many of those other Monsters of the Week are you going to buy out of toys? Right? In a war story, Mecha can come back. Mecha can be featured. Different Mecha can be there for different reasons. You can have aquatic machines. You can have air support machines. A whole galaxy of different mecha and other, vehicles and so forth and so on that are all part of this large narrative and that don't have that sense of here today, gone tomorrow. So it was massively more merchandisable. Now, unfortunately, the original company they were working with, Clover, I think it was, the original toy company, they made very sort of classic toys out of it, cheap plastic toys out of it. When the company, or when the series kind of tanked, at least in terms of popularity, they instead started working with a company named Bandai. Aha. And Bandai brought out model kits. Bandai was known for doing model kits of, real world airplanes and battleships and all that kind of stuff. And they said, let's do model kits of giant robots. Now, model kits are obviously aimed at a slightly older audience, and they caught on. They sold like gangbusters. And that really worked. And Bandai released these model kits that happened to be both inexpensive and high quality, relatively high quality. And Gundam started selling like nuts. But meanwhile, the staff had already moved on. Gundam was kind of a failure, and so Tomino moved on to make Space Runaway Ideon in 1980. Ideon's notable because Tomino re-earned his nickname. And I don't want to get into spoilers here, but yeah. It is the story also of a group of humans who are spreading throughout the galaxy. Humans are spreading throughout the galaxy. A group of humans stumble on this planet. They're basically an archaeological team, and they find this ancient, actually a group of vehicles that combine into a giant robot. As soon as they discover this, a signal gets broadcast out, and a nearby race of aliens who have not contacted the human race yet hear this signal and know that somebody has activated the Ideon. And the Ideon is this apocalyptic weapon of destruction in their history. It's a legend of this incredibly powerful thing that can just wipe out like all life in the universe. And so they immediately went in to investigate and find these aliens swarming all over it, us, and swoop in with their ships. And while we humans are sitting there investigating this thing, and suddenly all of these alien ships sweep in, and we're like, uh-oh, we better arm ourselves. And so it turns into this war between us and the aliens, despite the fact that neither of the group really wants to fight each other, right? The humans are kind of on the run from these aliens. The aliens are just freaking out about the Idion and just frightened about how powerful it is. And they don't hate humans themselves, but they're just freaking out about what the humans might do with the Idion. So it's a much more mature setup than you see in a lot of other anime series, and a lot more thoughtful. As Charles pointed out, the Idion really is that powerful. One of its weapons is a black hole gun, and it does that. And that's arguably not its most powerful weapon. Yeah. So, Idion, a thing. And was actually quite well respected at its time. At the time, anime fans, and anime fandom was starting to really coalesce at this point in Japan. Anime fans often considered Idion better than original Gundam, a more mature, more sophisticated, expression than original Gundam was. You could argue that, but people were very impressed with Idion at the time. A few years later, we would get a new mecha series that would kind of change things up a lot. Macross really combined two things. Not only were the giant robots now combining mecha, or transforming mecha, rather, that transformed into really, really cool fighter jets. Macross combined really, really high budget animation with this, Romance Among the Stars. And this is important because up until this point, usually anime studios did not get big budgets for anime. The reason anime always looked cheap is because the budgets were always incredibly low. And so with Macross, they somehow managed to get a big budget, and I don't know how they did, but they somehow managed to get a budget to make really high budget animation, really butter smooth animation. And as a result, Macross looked beautiful. And it also had material that brought in a female fan base. Now, it's not that girls never watched Mecha before, but these plot lines that were more about relationships definitely brought in a significant female audience. And that proved a couple of things. One is that Mecha could appeal to a wide base. And that animation and anime in general in Japan could look awesome if you gave people budgets. In fact, there were two animators in particular that worked on Macross, among others. A man named Ichiro Itano, which, if you've ever heard of the Itano Circus, so an animation of a bunch of missiles all kind of going off in trails going everywhere, that's called an Itano Circus. That is a thing that Itano pioneered. You see little bits of it. He actually worked on original Gundam. He did a bit of it in Gundam. You see a bit of more of it in Idion, and it finds like its full initial potential in Macross. And also a man named Hideaki Anno. We'll get back to him in a bit. Do you want to mention a few other things in passing? 1983 saw Our Bachelor Dunbean, which is the first, as far as I know, fantasy mecha series. It's actually the first isekai as well. And I mean that literally, the first isekai anime. Main character is transported to a fantasy world where people pilot these giant, but they're insectoid suits of armor, basically. Also a Yoshiyuki Tomino, excuse me. And really, really interesting series for that kind of concept. Really, really pretty. Yeah, it's a really interesting series. And pretty dark. I've not seen much of it, but little bits in pieces. So, first fantasy mecha series. 83 also saw Armored Trooper Votoms. And many people will consider Votoms to be essentially the series in which mecha as serious war drama first really got established. Obviously, you have that concept with original Gundam, but in Votoms, it feels like, well, roughly speaking, if original Gundam is World War II, Votoms is Vietnam. And all of these sort of dark psychological elements you'd imagine from a Vietnam War movie. And obviously, Japan didn't have the same experience in Vietnam that we did, but that kind of pattern of the American Vietnam movie, Apocalypse Now kind of thing, you see in Armored Trooper Votoms. And it became a very, very successful franchise as a result. So, again, not one of these things that completely changed everything, but an interesting note. A few years after that, we would come back to Gundam. Gundam was selling so well that they had actually commissioned a series of 3 anime movies that re-edited the footage from original Gundam and added some more material and released it in theaters. And that did so well, Mobile Suit Gundam got a 50-episode original anime sequel named Zeta Gundam. As far as I know, this is the first time, this is the second time that had ever happened in anime. Yamato had second seasons as well. But Gundam suddenly got a full series sequel. And, oh my gosh, the budget of Zeta Gundam. The difference in animation quality between Gundam and even just like Votoms and Dunbin are clear. Budgets were massively higher. And the story was also more complex. And there's a lot going on in Zeta Gundam, which I kind of can't get into here. And this led to more Gundam series, Double Zeta Gundam, Victory Gundam, so forth and so on. And Gundam kept on being made, and it was a huge force. Which led to this question. Because Tomino was directing all of these Gundam series. He directed original Gundam, Zeta, Double Zeta, so forth and so on. But Gundam had become such a juggernaut, there was a question. Was Gundam going to be a Tomino-only franchise? When something becomes that big, think Marvel movies, you need multiple creators involved. You need multiple directors involved. So in the late 80s, there was an intentional attempt to create a Gundam series not directed by Tomino to see, can somebody else make something that feels like Gundam who is not Yoshiki Tomino? And the result of that was Mobile Suit Gundam 0080 War in the Pocket from 1989. And the answer is yes. War in the Pocket very much feels like Gundam. It is an OVA set in the Gundam universe that explores the themes of war in Gundam in a perfectly condensed form. It doesn't feel perfect when you first watch it, I will warn you. It feels kind of awkward and weird. When you get to the ending, yep, it's all there. And that set the stage really for Gundam being the phenomenon it is today. Other things would happen, but they said, okay, we can now expand Gundam. Anyone can direct that. Obviously, you want to make sure they know what they're doing. But this can just go on and go on and go on impressively. Now, quick detour from Gundam. You'll notice all of the anime I'm talking about here have been serious stories. That is because original Mobile Suit Gundam essentially invented what we now call the real robot subgenre, as opposed to the super robot subgenre. Shows like Zambot 3 were super robot anime, meaning, tween young teen boy in giant robot fighting monster of the week, whereas a real robot anime is more about a recognizable war story. It's more serious, more dramatic. It's more about character growth, so forth and so on. Super robot heroes generally don't grow much over the course of the series, but there's usually some character growth over the course of a real robot show. And ever since Gundam, for the next decade, Super Robot was out. Real Robot was in. People were making real robot anime. That was the thing. Until 1990 and the surprise success of Brave X Kaiser, which was a Super Robot series that was just a Super Robot series. And this is about a tween boy who basically makes friends with these intelligent robots, very much Transformers, in terms of like intelligence, right? Like they can think on their own, act on their own. But he makes friends with them and kind of tells them what to do, so to speak, in that weird way of Mecha series where you're a unique individual, but you have to follow my commands. As a 10-year-old boy, I'm much smarter than you, ancient robot, whatever. But yeah, so Brave X Kaiser actually spun off a whole series of series called the Brave series. Brave X Kaiser led to King of Braves Gao Gaigar much later, a bunch of other series with Braves in the title, which were all about intelligent robots with tween boys, leading them essentially. And this was really the one shining light for Super Robot fans. Everything else was Real Robot. There was very little Super Robot being made at the time. If you wanted Super Robot, you had to go to the Brave franchise, more or less. Except that other things were happening in Gundam. By this point, there were quite a few Gundam series, and they were all set in the same timeline, Universal Century timeline. There was lots of stuff going on. And the timeline was frankly feeling kind of full. So what happened was Sunrise, the anime studio that made Gundam, was actually bought out by Bandai, the toy company that made Gundam, which concerned a lot of people at the time. And surprisingly, it worked out really well, because Bandai basically said, look, we're not going to tell you how to write a Gundam series. We're not going to tell you how to plot it out moment by moment. But we can tell that the Gundam franchise is kind of losing its way. So here's what we're going to do. We're going to fund 3 new Gundam TV series. Each one will be set in its own alternate timeline, completely new characters, completely new plot, completely new mecha. We're going to see if we can make some that feel like Gundam, and if any of them are successful, we will kind of move off in that direction. And their first attempt was Mobile Fighter G Gundam in 1994. And this is the Super Robot Gundam series. People call it Dragon Ball Gundam, which is a little unfair, but not inaccurate. As you can see, it's a rather over-the-top Gundam fighting show. And it was divisive. A lot of people loved it, especially younger fans who were aware of Gundam, but hadn't really got into the more serious Gundams. This was kind of their good introduction to Gundam. But the more established fans just did not like the Super Robot feel of G Gundam. So it was kind of a mixed bag. So, Gundam was looking a little worried at the time. Like, this is going to work out. We need a hit. We need a success. So the next year, they brought out Gundam Wing. Yeah, that worked. So Gundam Wing was a big hit in Japan and eventually over here in America. Why? A couple of reasons. One is that it is a very densely political series. So you have, big action series, but it's about colonists fighting for independence and sending teenagers down as basically terrorists to disrupt what's going on on Earth, and lots of different political groups going back and forth. But it also happens to feature 5 really, really pretty teenage boys. And this was very much intentional. They wanted to do kind of the Macross thing and bring in a female audience, large female audience. And again, Gundam had a sizable female audience to begin with. Not a not trivial size, but oh man, yes. Gundam Wing brought in the fans, both traditional mecha fans and new fans, and this really worked, especially when it came over to America on Toonami a couple of years later. But by then, something else had happened in Japan. Another mecha series had shown up. Neon Genesis Evangelion, the same year as Gundam Wing. Now, Evangelion is complicated to talk about because there's a lot around Evangelion. Evangelion was kind of the last gasp of its studio, in the sense that if they were not able to make Evangelion work, they were going to go out of business. Like, this was their last chance at being solvent, if you will. So it was kind of a desperate move for them to do a lot of the stuff they did in Evangelion. It was kind of like, we have one final shot of this, let's just throw everything in that we've ever wanted to do. It's also deeply psychological. It is also kind of exploring a lot of the things that was going on in Japan at the time, socially, economically. The Japanese economic bubble had burst in 1990. So this roaring economy of the 80s was suddenly slowing down. Folks were feeling this kind of malaise, and Evangelion really tapped into that with its mood and its tone. And it was a hit. Boy, was it a hit. Evangelion was just one of those, James Cameron's Avatar, Titanic, massively, Star Wars, massively successful series. Arguably out of proportion to any one thing you could point out to say, oh, that's why this was hugely popular, right? It just hit. It was the right thing at the right time. And it became kind of the template for a lot of anime to come. And you got some really interesting anime as a result. But honestly, once Evangelion came out, the mecha genre started to fade away. The next year, you got Martian Successor Nadesico, extremely popular at the time, and that is a mecha parody. It is a mecha series, but it also is parodying mecha in and of itself. There's actually the crew of the starship all become fans of a Super Robot show, like within the continuity of the show, and they're all sitting down to watch episodes of what's the name of it? I'll remember it soon. So they're watching this cheesy 70s giant robot show all the time within Nadesico. So very goofy, very funny, and kind of making fun of mecha in general. But you started seeing fewer and fewer mecha series. Gundam tried to get back into things with Gundam Seed, and succeeded wildly in 2002 with Gundam Seed, because Seed did some really smart things. Seed combined some of the elements of original Gundam, some of the setup ideas of original Gundam, with really pretty boy characters, and really pretty girl characters as well, and told a big epic action war story in a new alternate universe. And this really set up the pattern which Bandai had decided on once Gundam Wing exploded, that basically they would continue doing new alternate universes for Gundam on TV, but they'd make OVAs and movies in the original Universal Century timeline for the older established fans. So if you were into Gundam, you'd have OVAs movies every so often to enjoy, but you get new fans in through the TV series. And that became kind of the pattern. And Seed showed Gundam was still relevant and still successful and popular, and could still bring in huge amounts of fans. So Gundam was safe. But you see fewer and fewer mecha series. As I was researching for this panel, I was looking up more and more of these mecha series, and I couldn't find a lot of notable mecha series. Gurren Lagann, I think from 2007, is certainly a still fondly remembered, mecha series. But what did it change? Right? How is the anime industry affected? How is the mecha industry affected as a result of Gurren Lagann? I can't really think of anything. A few years ago we had Darling in the Franxx, 2018. And indeed, in the same year, SSSS Gridman. And these were both by Studio Trigger. Gurren Lagann is technically by Studio Trigger. It's sort of the same crew within Gainax. And they're really the ones keeping mecha going. Now, obviously, there are still mecha series being made today that are not by Trigger and not by other people. But the mecha genre itself has kind of faded into the background. I will say, from a historical perspective, one of the reasons is that as the 90s moved into 2000s, anime fans generally didn't want big, dramatic, sad war stories. They wanted comforting high school romance stories. They wanted harem anime. They wanted things that were, comforting blankets to watch. As they hit the lost decade of the 90s, and there was a lot of this soul searching. Yeah, exactly. Morphball. Girls replace Mecha in a in a reductive but accurate way. That was just a thing. You also have the issue and Morphball is actually is absolutely right here, in the sense that one of the problems Gundam has and Bandai has with Gundam is that very few people know how to draw mecha effectively anymore. That is increasingly a dying art. It's, with fewer mecha series, that is a specific skill. Being able to draw all those angles on all that armor. You look at something like, Strike Gundam here, and all the angles on that, and being able to animate that effectively, that's hard. And it's been hard for them to find enough staff to actually do a 2D animated Gundam series or mecha series in general. And so that's just that's kind of reality. And that is how things are in terms of the mecha industry. Which I don't mean to end on a negative note. Because I think mecha is one of those genres that exploded in popularity for a couple of different reasons. It was really cool for little boys to imagine them being either, remote controlling a giant robot or getting into a giant robot, very clear, obvious power fantasy. And then it capitalized on the science fiction fandom of the 80s and the sort of adventurous stories of the 90s to tell some big, wild, fun stories. But, this is a difficult thing. This is a genre that is not relevant for everyone all the time. It doesn't have to be hugely successful all the time. It doesn't have to be the big thing that everyone is watching all the time. It can ebb and flow. It can be big now, big in the past, smaller now, but folks are still making mecha series. It's still there. And the great thing is, if you want to get into mecha, there is so much to go back in and watch. There is a massively rich database of anime to pull from in mecha to explore. You're going to spend lots and lots of time. There's going to be years and years before you drain that well of just that mecha that already exists. So that is really, really cool, really fun. If you want mecha, it's there. You're just going to go back a few years to look at all that stuff. So that's a brief history of giant robots. I will answer any questions folks have in the chat in the next couple of minutes before we transition over to the Unagi Observer's Guns of Tanegashima panel. So the problem is not so much finding talent to draw mecha, it's that is a skill, that takes time to learn, right? No one is naturally talented, naturally skilled at drawing mecha. So you have to either have grown up drawing mecha and kind of figure it out, or have been at an anime studio that is making mecha all the time and is thus teaching people how to draw mecha. But give an industry 10 and 15 years where very few people are doing that, and the only people drawing mecha are the ones who already know how to do it. None of the new staff is being taught that skill because there's no need for it, right? You can just get those dozen people who already know how to do it for the shows you're doing, and it dies out. Thank you, Box. Appreciate that. I do my best. So yeah, it's an interesting situation, skill-wise. And you have the problem that, similarly, because there hasn't been a lot of mecha series, animators getting into the industry aren't necessarily interested in drawing mecha. Right? It used to be everyone wanted to draw mecha, everyone wanted to work on a mecha show. Folks don't anymore. They want to work on Naruto or One Piece, right? That's what gets people into anime now. Yeah, super intimidating skill set. It's really, really tough. Yeah, even just drawing manga of mecha is not easy. Drawing the same mecha from multiple angles, that's tough. Legit tough. So, you do what you can. That is just the nature of things. Cool. We're going to transition over and take a quick break. We'll be back in just about 8 minutes, 7 minutes, with the Guns of Tanegashima panel. See you in a bit.